Well, good morning. Good morning. So my name is Seth Kurtz, and first of all, I just want to say thank you. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you to the pastoral search team who has worked so hard over a number of months. Thank you to the board for the work that you have done to continue the trajectory of this church forward, to keep things moving. Thank you to JC for coming into this role as an interim. And yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And I also want to thank all of you for continuing to be the hands and feet of Jesus, for continuing to love Jesus and to pursue him regardless the circumstances. And so I'm excited. And the thing about new seasons is that they often can be exciting. And have you ever noticed how in these exciting moments, time just seems to fly, right? Those are the moments that you look back and you're like, what happened, right? Where did that go? And this got me thinking about a while back, our kids went to the zoo and over in Fresno. And Micah, our third child, he's actually sitting over here. He is Spider-Man. And some people here know that. They know what I'm talking about. But he was so excited to go and see the lions. And so I get in like full-on dad mode, right? I'm like, I'm going to get my son to the lions. And so I'm trying to get these kids in order, in line. There's 4 of them, so it's a lot. And I'm like trying to get these kids in order and everything. I'm trying to get them to address me as yes, sir, which still has never happened ever. But, I'm trying. And we get these kids out. We get them. The first thing is we got to get through the line to get in the zoo. We went on a holiday weekend, why? But we did. And so there's this massive line. We're all waiting. And the kids are just built up with excitement, right? They're running around, they're bumping into people, they're screaming about the animals they're going to see. They're making me anxious about what other people are thinking about our psychotic kids and all this kind of stuff. And then we finally get to the front of the line. We get into the zoo. We walk through the doors, and Nora, she's little, she's still in a stroller, but the other 3 just scatter, right? And so now we got we're trying to wrangle these kids in. I'm trying to get these kids in line. We got to get to the lions, right? And so we get them all lined up, and then here's what happens. Actually, I don't remember really what happened from there because I was so focused on getting Micah to the lions. I was in so much of a hurry to get Micah to the lions that I missed the rest of it, right? Have you been there? Right? I know that my kids went and saw other animals. I know that they said things and thought things and these interactions happened, but I missed them. I was so hurried to get to the lions that I don't remember the rest, right? I actually forgot to be present in that moment with my kids. And isn't that so like us, right? To just let hurry have its way in our lives and then look back and realize that we don't even actually know what it's been able to steal from us. And I think that Jesus has a lot to say to us about this. And actually, maybe it's less so what he has to say to us about this, and more what we can learn by watching the pace at which he lived his life. Right? So if you've got your Bibles with you this morning, we're going to be in the book of Mark, chapter 5. If you don't, there are free apps that you can download on your phone, just saying, but also we will have them on the screens, and you're welcome to follow along there. Mark chapter 5, and to set the scene a little bit, Jesus he's just traveled by boat across a lake, and there was this man filled with a bunch of demons, and the demons spoke to him and said that we are legion, for we're many, right? So this is straight up horror movie, and Jesus cast the demons out. He ends up getting back in the boat, and when he sails back across the lake, that's where we're picking up, right? So in verse 21, it says, when Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. It wasn't until I was doing some studying on this passage that I realized that most of the people with whom Jesus interacts in the gospel accounts, outside of the apostles themselves, most of the people with whom he interacts are not named. We don't get names for the vast majority of people, but Jairus is named here. Now, maybe that's because he's a synagogue leader, right? Maybe that's because of his status in society. But maybe it's because Jesus, in the midst of this crowd, slows down and made it a point to know this man, to see this man, right? I've noticed that in this incredibly busy season of meeting new people, like there are a lot of you guys, remembering names is not what it used to be for me. It is not the same. And I've called people the wrong name a few times. I apologize for that. It's going to take me a while. So I feel like it's a little unfair. All you guys get to pick up on Seth fairly quickly, and then I'm like, everyone, right? And what I've realized is it takes more than just shaking somebody's hand and saying, hey, nice to meet you, right? It takes more effort for me now to remember names than just that. Truly getting to know somebody's name means sitting down, talking with them, hearing their story, listening to them, right? And there was something about Jairus that caused the gospel authors to look at this story and choose to write down his name, to include that in the text. Jesus was clearly present with this man. Right? I mean, imagine, like this starts with Jesus before he crossed over the lake. He was swarmed by crowds, right? And then he goes and he heals this man and casts legion out of him. He comes back across the lake and there's swarms of crowds again, right? Everybody's pressing in on him. And do you know what crowds do when they get around Jesus? They beg for miracles, right? That's what they're doing. They're begging for miracles. They're pleading for miracles. And what better miracle to ask for than the one that you need, right? Jesus, do this for me. Right? I realize there are a lot of people here, but do this for me. This makes me think of, those of you who are married, those of you especially who have kids will probably understand, when all the kids are just like, mom, 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 and then your husband walks in the door and he's like, hey, so what's for dinner, right? Right? Like, I don't even need to finish the story. You guys know. You know. And yet, in the midst of the chaos of this crowd, Jesus hears this man. He hears him. He sees him. What stands out to me is that Jesus had time for this man's panic. Jesus had time for this man's panic. As Jairus is living in a world where he is watching his daughter's life drain away from her, he is now throwing himself at the feet of Jesus and allowing all of the panic to exit his body in the form of begging for a miracle, begging for Jesus to simply touch her so that she might be healed. I've heard a lot in my life that when people are panicked, having anxiety, depression, or what have you, that there are others who will say that you just need to have a little bit more faith, right? And now, don't hear me wrong here. Faith is never a bad thing, right? If you can have more faith, have more faith. But the reality is that the presence of Jesus is not contingent upon the amount of faith that you have to offer him, right? The presence of Jesus is not contingent upon the amount of faith that you have to offer him. When I look around at all the different religions that this world has to offer us, there's one thing in particular that stands out to me about Christianity. Jesus is willing to sit in the darkness with us. Even when we're doubting, even when faith is hard, Jesus is willing to sit in the anxiety, in the panic with us. Church, Jesus has time for your panic. Jesus has time for your anxiety. And in our story, there's all these people surrounding Jesus, and they're certainly yelling out for their own miracle to be fulfilled, while Jairus is at the end of his rope just hoping for anything that might stop his daughter from dying, and Jesus is present. Jesus is with him, right? Like, to me, one of the most interesting parts of this whole story said Jesus hasn't even said anything. Right? Jesus doesn't say anything to Jairus. It simply says that he went with him. He was present. He was there when he needed him to be there. In the face of panic, Jesus has his presence to offer. You know, Dallas Willard once said that hurry is the great enemy of spiritual life, and that we must relentlessly eliminate hurry from our lives. Now, if you're like me, you're like, all right, Dallas, clearly you're not living in our world, buddy, right? Like, apparently you haven't seen how busy things are. You haven't seen what's demanded of us, right? But then I love that in his book, Soul Keeping by John Ortberg, who was a student of Dallas Willard, John addresses the difference between busyness and hurry, and here's what he says. Quote, busyness is a condition of the body when we have many things to do. Busyness is inevitable in our modern culture. If you're alive in North America, you are a busy person. Being hurried is an inner condition, a condition of the soul. It means to be so preoccupied with myself and my life that I am unable to be fully present with God, with myself, and with other people. Busyness migrates to hurry when we allow it to squeeze God out of our lives. You know, this to me seems to be the fundamental difference between how Jesus did ministry and how so many churches today do ministry, right? Like, we actually allow the busyness of ministry to turn into hurry as it squeezes God out of our lives. We're so focused on simply accomplishing tasks that we miss to be present in the moment. We want to help as many people as we can. So in order to do that, we turn those people into numbers and objects rather than seeing them as individuals who are actually made in the image of our Creator God. Church, Jesus has the time for your panic. Jesus has the time for your anxiety. Jesus has the time for your problems. Jesus lived his life at the pace of grace, which meant that there was no room for hurry in him. So then what happens? We pick it up in the back half of verse 24. And it says, a large crowd followed and pressed around him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. And when she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. And immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. Now, let's talk about a few things that are going on here before we move on, all right? Uncleanness is a really important thing in Jewish culture. And the sort of bleeding that this woman would have been going through would have made her perpetually unclean. Just constantly unclean. So what does that mean? It means that she can't get married, right? That's likely a huge reason that she was already out of money. There was no way to have a source of income. It means that she could not have community. She would have had to declare to people everywhere that she went that she was unclean so that they could avoid her to avoid becoming unclean themselves. It meant that she couldn't have God because she would not have been allowed in the temple until the bleeding stopped. This woman would have been a total outcast in society, the complete opposite of a leader like Jairus, right? Well, Jairus came and he threw himself at the feet of Jesus. This woman, who's not named, sneaks up behind him. And she has the faith that she can receive healing from him, but she doesn't want anyone to know that she's there. And so in verse 30, it says this. It says, at once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. And he turned around in the crowd and asked, who touched my clothes? You see the people crowding against you, his disciples answered, and yet you can ask, who touched me? But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Right now, I love the apostles' response here, right? The disciples who are like, they're walking, they're going with Jesus, they're heading to Jairus, and there's all these crowds pressed up against Jesus, right? This is like my 4 kids that constantly, like bubbles don't exist with kids, right? They're just constantly pressed up against you. All these people are pressed up against Jesus, and he stops and says, "Who touched me?" And the disciples are like, "Everyone?" Like, what are you talking about, Jesus? Now imagine for a moment, though, what's going through Jairus' mind, right? Like, your daughter is dying, and Jesus just turned around to ask, who touched him? What does it matter, Jesus? My kid is dying, right? Like, have you guys ever worked with somebody who has ADD, like severe ADD? I have this coworker at South Valley, and if he watches this, he will know that I'm talking about him. He knows. And this is the kind of guy that, I've worked with the tech team, so there are times that I have to like run wires and things like that, and I'm like, hey man, I need help just like moving a ladder real quick. Can you help me out? Right? And he's like, oh yeah, for sure, right after I finish this email. Okay, so I wait on the email to get finished, and as we're walking out of the office, he stops and he talks to the office administrator. And so I'm like, okay, I sit and I wait for him to finish the conversation. Then we get outside, and he's like, oh, hold on, I forgot my keys in the car. And so he's got to go walk over to his car, get the keys, lock it up and everything. We start walking back over to the worship center. We get in the doors, and he's like, oh, sorry, I forgot. I need to call the bug people. So he gets on the phone, and he calls the bug people, right? And then we finally get to the ladder, and his wife calls, and he walks out of the room on the phone with his wife. And I'm like, I just want to get the ladder moved, right? Like, now this is just for moving a ladder, right? I can't imagine how it would be, how I would be, if this was for something as serious as my children's health. If this was my doctor, right? And yet, this is Jesus. In this moment, this is Jesus. Making time in this moment, even when it seemed so inappropriate. Jesus made time for interruptions. Jesus made time for interruptions. See, here's the thing. Literally, everyone in this crowd has been touching Jesus. They're all pressed up against him while they're traveling to Jairus' house. Only one person was healed. Only one person had been healed. And imagine, this woman knows full well that Jesus is talking about her. Right? She's done everything that she can to protect her anonymity. She is terrified that she could make Jesus unclean. She's terrified that she could have made somebody else unclean. Her goal was to get in, get healed, and slink away without anybody knowing that she was ever there in the first place. And then Jesus starts calling out. This reminds me, this is a terrible story. This reminds me back in the day when we had just one family computer, right? And it ran on dial-up. And all those terrific sounds that told everybody you were getting on the internet and don't you dare answer the phone, right? And so I have always been somebody who loves technology, and I've loved to mess with things and try to learn them. And the problem is that my dad loves his computer working and not being messed with by his son who is experimental. And there'd be times that I'd sneak into my dad's room and I'd get on the computer to make it better, And then later that day, I'm back in my room doing my own thing, and out of nowhere I hear, "Who touched my computer?" Right? And I'm like, like the fear of that moment, the panic in that moment. Like, I know it's me. He knows it's me. Do I have to say anything? Right? Like, how did he find out? I didn't even do anything that big, right? I don't even remember what I did, right? And the questions that must have been racing through this woman's head as Jesus calls her out. In this moment where she thinks she's been healed and she can slink away, and Jesus says, "Who touched me?" Verse 33. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. We don't deal with purity laws like they did, so I think we will struggle to really capture the weight of this. But this was unacceptable behavior. The people would have been furious with her. She put them all in danger. This is why she's so fearful. And as she falls at the feet of Jesus, it says that she was trembling with fear. She's been healed, and yet all she has is fear. What are the crowds going to do to her? Are they going to start picking up stones and try to kill her for putting them all at risk? That's where Jesus comes in. Verse 34, he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." You know, at first glance, it looks like Jesus is just addressing her and sending her off. But church, there is so much more going on here than just that. Do you know what Jesus does not call any other person in the entirety of the gospel accounts? Daughter. Daughter. This woman. There's a reason that Jesus takes a moment to call this woman out. This woman who has been an outcast for 12 years. This woman who has not felt touch for 12 years. This woman who has lived feeling disgusted by her own body for 12 years. This woman who has not been able to experience God for 12 years. And in this moment, the crowd's filled with rage because what if she touched me? She came from this way. How do I know that I'm not unclean now? And Jesus, for her sake, but also for the sake of everybody standing around them, calls this woman daughter. I want you to think about the weight of this. Imagine the weight of 12 long years of suffering. And then you get called out and you're waiting to hear your condemnation spoken to you. Just to hear Jesus call you daughter. Imagine the weight of the stone that you're lifting as you're the one standing in the crowd, full of rage. And imagine what happens to the weight of that stone as your rage is addressed by Jesus saying, no. This one's mine. This girl belongs to me. Why did Jesus make a scene out of this? Because Jesus moved at a pace that allowed him to make time for interruptions. And that interruption allowed Jesus to show this woman love. What was it really that this woman hadn't felt for 12 years? It was love. And Jesus showed that to her. And these crowds, they're following Jesus, excited to see what he does next. And that suddenly turns into rage and disgust for this woman. And Jesus quickly acts as the parent and makes it clear that just as Jairus rushes to save his little girl, Jesus is rushing to the rescue of his own little girl right here and now. That's our Jesus, church. That's the Jesus we worship. If anyone wants to take up issue with this woman, they got to go through Jesus. Church, have you really taken the time to consider the extreme efforts that Jesus constantly goes through to show you just how much you are loved? I think sometimes we get this idea that Jesus is so overwhelmed with worrying about all the other problems that there are in the world that there's no way that he could have time for what's going on in my life. But this story, this moment, as Jesus locks eyes with this unnamed woman and is calling her daughter, this is a reminder that Jesus has all the time in the world for you. He has the time to stop and ask who touched him when it comes to his children. And as we live out the Christian life, I think that we need to be reminded of this moment. We need to be reminded of what Jesus has done, and we need to be reminded that if we're going to love people the way that Jesus has loved us, we probably got a lot of work to do. I know I do. The story got me thinking hard about all the people I've seen in my life who needed help, and I just simply moved on. And while I've moved on, Jesus has moved with compassion. And I just want so badly for Jesus to fill me and to fill his people with the compassion that he has for humanity. But hold on a second, right? There's a story going on here, right? This moment is moving and powerful, but Jairus, his daughter, right? Like, what's going on? Verse 35. While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. Your daughter is dead, they said. Why bother the teacher anymore? Jairus came to Jesus full of panic. And Jesus has been walking alongside Jairus in that panic. And that panic has spiked as Jesus has slowed down for this woman. And while millions of thoughts and fears are swirling through Jairus' head, and I can only imagine that he's internally pleading with Jesus to please hurry up and move on to his daughter next, someone speaks up while Jesus is still addressing the woman. Your daughter's dead, Jairus. As Jesus calls this unnamed woman daughter, Jairus' own daughter has passed. The despair, right? Like we all know that the parents aren't supposed to lose their children. And now Jairus and his panic are swirling in the ugliest way possible as they merge and marry with despair. But the people tell him not to bother the teacher anymore. The teacher. Is that all he is? Why did Jairus come to Jesus if all he is a teacher? Why did Jairus believe that a touch could heal his daughter if he's just a teacher? So in verse 36, it says, overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, he speaks up to Jairus, don't be afraid, just believe. Don't be afraid, just believe. And he didn't let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And when they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. And he went in and said to them, why all this commotion and wailing? Child's not dead, she's asleep. But they laughed at him. And after he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in to where the child was. You know, every moment of this story has been Jesus surrounded by crowds. He's had the crowd of his own apostles, and then there are the crowds as he gets off the boat who are excited to see a miracle. They were there the moment he got off the boat. So they were there when Jairus fell at his feet. They were there when the woman with the bleeding disorder was healed. And the moment Jesus heard that Jairus' daughter was dead, he sent away the crowds. He gets to the house and there are crowds there. They're wailing and crying, and Jesus sends them away. And he sent away his own crowd, keeping only 3 with him. And so Jesus enters into the room with just mom, dad, and a few disciples. This again is about the pace at which Jesus lives and does ministry. The crowds were here to see a miracle, and here's the opportunity for the biggest one yet. And Jesus sends them all off. Because it's not about the fanfare. It's not about everyone getting to see this and getting excited. It's not about just capturing people's emotions and feelings. But to Jesus, this is an opportunity for him to personally love this family, to be with them in this moment that is certainly the most important moment of their lives to this point. Jesus made time for family. In verse 41, as Jesus is in the room with the little girl, it says, he took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. And immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. And at this, they were completely astonished, and he gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. You know, a lot of times I think that we think about Jesus as this big, powerful man barking orders because, well, he's God, right? But knowing the way that Jesus did ministry and knowing the pace at which he lived, I think it's incredibly likely that Jesus would have gotten on his knees next to this little girl and put his face right next to her, just like her daddy might. He said, hey, little girl, it's time to get up. You got a whole life ahead of you to live. And she gets up. Now, why would I think this, right? Look at how Jesus was with the last woman he interacted with, right? If anyone knows about family, it's Jesus. This single man who lived his whole life as a single man knows family unlike any of us. This is a man who knows family, and this is a man who takes time for family. His pace allowed him to show deep and meaningful grace to this family. His pace teaches us to make time for family. Maybe that's our church family. Maybe it's immediate family. But I think Jesus is calling us all to slow down and learn to love people well. He's calling us to slow down and learn to love our families well. You know, I started by telling the story of taking my kids and my family to the zoo. The irony of the whole thing is that we did, in fact, make it to the lions at some point. And wouldn't you know it, that by that point, Micah didn't even care, right? He wasn't concerned anymore. And this is exactly why Jesus is leading us to slow down, to really practice what it means to be present, to practice what it means to be family. And then I love this tiny detail. He tells them to make sure that she gets something to eat, right? Like what a weird detail to include. Jesus, he goes in and heals this girl, right? He could have just made her full at the same time, but he doesn't. He's like, hey, mom and dad, go get her some food, right? Now listen. I know that this is Sunday. I know how this works. Y'all are already checked out thinking about where you're going to go to lunch, right? Right? So hear me on this. Rather than just thinking about where you're going to get lunch, I want you to start thinking about who you're going to take to lunch with you. Right? This is an opportunity now for you to slow down. It's not just a moment to put the food in your body that you need to survive. It's a moment to build some relationships, to invest in people, to hear stories, to grow. Busyness is external. We're all busy, right? But imagine what life would look like if we could all learn to ruthlessly eliminate hurry from our lives. What if we could see the amount of grace that Jesus had because of the pace at which he lived his life? Imagine what the world would think if they saw a church that lived at the same pace that Jesus lived. Church, it was Jesus' pace that allowed him to work his way to the cross. It was his pace that allowed him to, the time to sit and to sweat these great drops of blood as he panicked and feared for what was to come. It was his pace that led him through every single moment that he went to, the crucifixion and beyond, that would lead to his reunification with you. The gospel itself hinges on the fact that Jesus lives his life at the pace of grace. Now, I have three takeaways for you this morning. Number one, in your busyness, ask, where is God? Where is he, right? Because hurriedness, that squeezes God out of your life. And so the way to identify, am I busy or am I hurried? Just ask, where is God? Where is he in this moment? Number two, make time for interruptions. Make time for your kids to interrupt you. Make time for your church family to interrupt you. Make time for that coworker who you're not looking forward to seeing tomorrow. Make time for them to interrupt you. Make time for Jesus to interrupt you. Some of you in here this morning, you may not even have a relationship with Jesus this morning. You may have never experienced that moment of Jesus seeing you in all of your despair and brokenness and looking at you as the world rages and calling you son or daughter. I want to implore you that today is the day to make time for Jesus to step in and interrupt your story. to see that he just desperately wants relationship with you. He loves you as you are. And all he asks is that you would say, I'm done doing this life on my own. Jesus, I'm going to follow you with everything that I've got. So number 2, make time for interruptions. Number 3, the words that Jesus said to Jairus himself. Don't be afraid. Just believe. Listen, life is so full of things to be afraid of. Media thrives on throwing at you things to be afraid of. Media tries to get you to hurry with fear. Because if you hurry, then you're not all in it and you're more likely to spend money and to do things that you wouldn't otherwise do without slowing down and thinking. And Jesus is saying to us, I've got it, guys. I've got this under control. Don't be afraid. Just believe. Let's pray. God, I just want to thank you this morning for the well. I want to thank you this morning for the team that's here and for the people who have made this continue to happen through this season that they're in. God, I just want to lay everything down at your feet this morning. Every single person in here who's broken, who's hurting, every single person who's on a high right now and is loving life and is satisfied in all their ways. God, I just pray that you would step and equally show yourself in a full and present way to every person here this morning. God, I pray that you would meet us in a new and unique way. I pray for any of those who haven't yet stepped into relationship with you that they would see just how good and just how real you are. God, we love you. We praise you. We lay our lives at your feet. It's in your perfect name we pray. Amen.